Thanks. Before starting, I would like really to thank Sophie for this opportunity, not only of like being here today and presenting my ongoing work, but also for hosting me here at Université Saint Louis in these last weeks. It has been really a great pleasure, and I'm really happy that I had this opportunity. So big thanks to Sophie, and also big thanks to Professor Cullen, that is on the other side of the screen, and who kindly agreed, to act as a discussant here for this very, very preliminary paper. So I will now, just jump on this paper, and before I start with the content, I would like to specify that this is really preliminary, meaning that it's really the very first time that I kind of share these thoughts in words with somebody. I've been reading and thinking and reflecting about it on my own. And it's really important for me to have your feedback here today. In order to improve and to strengthen the main argument, and to see what makes sense and what doesn't. So I apologize for changing the title and also the main content of the presentation. The previous title was very much focusing on intersectional discrimination against Romani women. Now I'm really focusing on intersectionality mainstreaming. This change happened throughout my reading process and reflection process. So I decided anyway to, apologies for my voice, I'm sorry. Okay. So I decided anyway to keep this new version, in order to have more substantial feedback from you, Pauline, but also from all the people present here today, that I would like also to thank a lot for their interest in my work. So this new title is Intersectionality Mainstreaming in EU Equality Policies, Reflections on the Promises and Perils of a Novel Approach. And this title already gives you a sense of what this paper is about, but also on the fact that it's a reflection paper. So it's really to foster a debate. That's the main purpose. But I will go back to this in a minute. Quickly on the presentation overview. So today I will briefly share with you why I think this reflection paper is needed, why it is important to foster debate on the possibilities of an intersectionality mainstreaming in EU equality policies. And then I will provide you with a bit of context, both from an academic point of view, so really the academic debate where this paper is located, and also in terms of policies, so the policy shifts, why we can actually start talking about intersectionality mainstreaming in 2023, and how this all started. So really to contextualize a bit this issue in terms of policies, I will use some examples from the Union of Equality Strategies. Also, I will zoom into this later on. And I will then engage with some preliminary reflections. And this is really the core issue here, although it comes only at the very end of the presentation, but it is the core issue, and I would really appreciate feedback on this last part. So if really my preliminary reflections can make sense also to others and not only to myself. So I start with this quote This quote is coming from an interview to Laura Corradi. Laura Corradi is an Italian feminist, eco-feminist scholar. She's been one of the pioneers of intersectionality. She's a sociologist and one of the pioneers of intersectionality studies in Italy. And last year, she was interviewed by other Italian intersectionality scholars from other disciplines. I took just one short quote from this very, very interesting interview that unfortunately is only in Italian. So those of you who are interested, should wait a bit for the translation. This quote says, "It's evident that in this quarter of a century, some things have changed. From an unknown approach after the only theoretical positioning of European institutions against multiple discriminations, intersectionality has become almost fashionable. I would dare to say it has partly become mainstreamed." So why did I decide to use this quote? Because I think that most of what I'm trying to say and to reflect upon within this paper can be really summarized here. So we have a lot of to discuss about this policy shift, and we will do so in a while. So in a moment. So really, the policy shift from the multiple discrimination to a more intersectional understanding of inequalities, and also to reflect a bit on these terms that she uses here. So the fact that intersectionality was really unknown, so invisible, to fashionable. And this fashionable, it's something she uses almost as a synonym of mainstreamed. So I think this is, there is something interesting there that we should look at in a critical way and maybe try to dig into it a bit more in depth. So why this reflection paper? For this reason, for also tracing this shift of intersectionality from invisible to mainstreamed in an EU equality agenda, and to do so critically. So this is a bit the purpose for me, the purpose of this paper. And I was briefly just mentioning a few works that I'm building upon and also trying to contribute to. So the main strengths of literature on intersectionality in public policies. I will not go through all the works that I'm mentioning there, but I would be happy also to engage with this more in depth afterwards during the Q&A. The EU gender equality policy making, and also the intersectionality mainstreaming in research. So not only in policy making, but also to reflect more on how we use intersectionality mainstreaming in research. And then there will also be another strand of literature that I'm not using here for this presentation here today, but I will use in the paper, that is really on Romani feminists, Romani related policies, and so on. But this is not, it's not the focus of today's presentation. That's why I haven't included these references here. So I will try to be concise, so quick, but also clear in on this, like providing you with a bit of context concerning the academic debate. So where is this paper located, and to what it tries to talk to? And so it's it all started actually 1 decade ago. So this is important. This time frame is important because you will see that the changes also in the academic debates and in policies have been in a way kind of happening more or less at the same time. So the academic debate about about intersectionality and policies, intersectionality in policy making, and so on, has gone through, in my view, three main focuses. So the first one on institutional legislation, where the focus, really the approach, was on equality institutionalization. So basically, scholars were really focusing on equality institutions. So how intersectionality is really translated into the way equality institutions work in Europe. So how they are structured, do they work together in a kind of integrated manner? Do they work individually, every institutional body on its own topic? So all these questions about really equality institutionalization and now how intersectionality was actually included into this process of equality institutionalization. So we had this first phase where one of the main, the most relevant work was an edited volume by Andrea Christiansky and Squeers from 2012, and the title was actually Institutionalizing Intersectionality, because that was really the hard focus. So equality institutionalization and how intersectionality fits with it. Then, more or less at the same time, other scholars, mainly gender scholars, European gender scholars, started also reflecting on intersectionality in relation to policy making and especially to the quality of policies. So how to improve, can intersectionality actually improve the quality of policies? The answer was yes, but how? How can intersectionality do so? And this literature has been mainly divided into some works focused mainly on the formulation, policy formulation. So is intersectionality, how is intersectionality addressed and articulated into really the policy documents? So in the way we frame and we formulate policies. And here I'm mainly referring to Lombardo and Roland and Augustin, again from 2012. And then also later work on the policy implementation. And we have some new or some recent works that, in my opinion, are really, really fascinating, that are assessing really like whether intersectionality is actually translated into how policies are implemented. So if we can go beyond just an articulation, a reference to intersectionality in policy making, also in practical, if there is this kind of more practical shift and empirical kind of use of intersectionality. And then, and this is important because the idea for this paper mainly started from this old paper of mine. So I'm not trying now to be self-referential. That's I was not referring to myself for this reason, but mainly because almost 10 years ago, I was trying to put these two approaches together. So the approach on equality institutionalization and the approach on the quality of policies in order to assess the operationalization of intersectionality in EU equality policies. So I developed a set of criteria that it was putting together these two different approaches. And when I sent my application here for this visiting fellow stay here with Sophie, my idea was exactly to look back at this paper from 10 years ago and saying, okay, but so what happened in between? Because then I started working a lot on intersectional activism, and this paper stayed there a bit kind of forgotten. And I think that looking at the new EU policies on equalities, it's very important that I bring it back and I try to look at it again, and that argument, if it's still actually valuable, and how I can still improve it, and how can I still apply those criteria to what we have today in terms of policies. If you want, we can go more in depth into this criteria sets later on. And also I prepared a slide here, but maybe we can go back to this afterwards. This is I'm zooming in here on the quality approach. So the approach for the improving the quality of policies. And why? Because this paper I'm presenting is very much about really at the stage of formulation of the policies. We cannot yet see the implementation of these new strategies at EU level because they are very new, but we can already reflect on the formulation. And so I was zooming into Lombardo and Roland's and Augustine work concerning good intersectionality, good policy making, okay? And I was just summarizing the criteria for this good policy making by using an intersectional perspective that they were referring to. So very briefly, because then we will go back to this later. I would like to emphasize that they are working on at the level of policy formulation. They are not looking at implementation, and they are they identify these 8 criteria as possible criteria for really assessing the quality of policies. So the explicitness and visibility of certain inequalities, but also the inclusiveness of a wide range of multiple inequality categories, the articulation, so the way intersectionality is articulated, the gendering of policy issues and intersecting inequalities, the transformative approach to intersectionality, the structural understanding of inequality, the awareness and challenging of privilege, the avoiding the stigmatization of specific groups, and finally, the consultation with civil society in policymaking processes. So for them, these were like essential criteria for really assessing the quality of policymaking and the operationalization of intersectionality. I decided to zoom into this to make sense also to my argument that is coming later on. So we can come back to this slide later. Also, this is something we can maybe go back to in the Q&A. It's just a table summarizing the work that I did in 2015 on Romani women policies, but we can go back to this later. I just to keep, not to be too distracted too much. So I try to summarize a bit the academic debate, so the context in terms of academic debates. Now I will quickly go through the context, but in terms of policy shifts. As I was saying, what we saw a bit in academic work was kind of reflected, or maybe the other way around, I don't know, maybe what we saw in policies were reflected. Also in the transformation of policies. So in the early 2000s, following the entry into force of the Amsterdam Treaty and then the so-called equality directives in 2000, we really experienced a transition of EU equality agenda from a single strand to a multiple strand approach to discrimination. What does it mean? It means that finally there was the awareness that discrimination could be experienced on more than one grounds. That was the way the Commission was framing it. It is also important to say that this concept, this new concept of multiple discrimination was actually there, but in a quiet, was there mainly in soft law kind of documents and only in the preamble of the equality directives. So the concept was there. The fact that it was in the preamble of the equality directives was important, but we can not really assume that it became immediately like kind of consolidated way of understanding discrimination. And there are many reasons for this, but then the first shift happened at the beginning of the 2010s, where slowly, very slowly, intersectionality started a bit entering also the policy language at the EU level. So it was still, political intersectionality was still very embryonic stage in EU policy making, but we could find some statements on combating intersectional discrimination, although mainly in soft law instruments or policy programs. So it's not yet hard law, and it's still, at the beginning of the 2010s, it was still very much misunderstood as a concept. It was very often used, but not really addressed in a consistent way. So policies were still, in terms of formulation, still very confusing about the way they were using the concept of intersectionality. But anyway, we can see that there was a shift, that there was a change, something that was starting, changing in the way the EU equality policies were formulated. And finally, in the last decade, we can really, and we will see it in a moment with some concrete examples. We can really start talking about a new shift from a multi-strand approach, so multiple discrimination approach, to discrimination towards a more intersectional understanding of inequalities and difference. I don't know if all of you are familiar a bit with this concept of multiple discrimination and intersectional discrimination that I kind of taking for granted. So the concept of multiple discrimination is more based on a kind of an additive approach. So it's built on the idea that we have different grounds of discrimination, for instance, based on, I don't know, races, more sexes, more classism, and so on. And then that we can, it's kind of counting. So we have one on the other, and the sum of the different grounds can make the issue of discrimination stronger. That was a bit the logic behind. Intersectional discrimination is something else, because yes, it assumes that there are different axes and systems of oppression and marginalization, but it doesn't look at them as something that can be really distinguished, can be divided, that can be added to each other. It really looks at the intersection, at the points, at the experience, individual specific experience that is located at where all these different axes and systems of oppression are crossing each other, are really intersecting, and it's interlocking. So at that specific point of at the intersection, the experience of discrimination is unique. And this is what makes it different from the additive logic of the multiple discrimination principle. So just a few examples from the Union of Equality strategies. This Union of Equality strategies is something very innovative. I was very surprised when I saw it for the first time, because I think that there is really an effort towards, trying to make this intersectionality happen in EU equality policies. So, and you will see why. So the Union of Equality is kind of an umbrella term that includes 5 different equality strategies. One concerned gender, the other one LGBTIQ plus policies, Roma integration participation, now it's called differently, luckily. So the Roma, then we have disability, and then the 5th one, I'm missing one. Yeah, exactly, the EU anti-racism plan. So these are the 5 main pillars that then creates this Union of Equality strategy. And it's we will see there are different time frames, but it's basically it covers the decade 2020-2030 with different time frames, because some of the strategies only go up to 2025. So the goal is really to mainstreaming equality in all EU policy initiatives through an intersectional perspective. And this is not something that we deduce from like the way they are. It's really very explicit. So we go back to the criteria for assessing the quality of policy. This is explicit. It becomes explicit. So in order to follow a bit the logic of the equality, the quality criteria from Lombardo and Rollins and Augustine that we saw before, we can already tick a first box of yes, finally it's explicit. But let's see how it is explicit. I prepared just a few examples only from 3 of the strategies. So the gender equality strategy, the anti-racism action plan, and Roma strategy. I didn't use examples from the disability and the LGBTIQ plus strategies, but I checked and they use the same definition of intersectionality and the same explicit language. So So the first, what is from the gender equality strategy, and it says the Commission will enhance gender mainstreaming, but systematically including a gender perspective in all stages of policy design in all EU policy areas, internal and external. The strategy will be implemented using intersectionality, the combination of gender with other personal characteristics or identities, and how these intersections contribute to unique experiences of discrimination as a cross-cutting principle. So what is relevant here is, first of all, this willingness to mainstream intersectionality. So as a cross-cutting principle, it means that they want to use intersectionality in all EU policies as a cross-cutting principle. Okay, so there is already quite explicit message that we should welcome and really as a step forwards, as a promising kind of formulation. But, and there is a but, and we will go back to this at the end when I discuss a bit more the reflection. Here it says the combination of gender with other personal characteristics or identities. Why do I find this problematic? For two reasons. First, because it puts gender first. And although this is the gender equality strategy, this is the kind of definition they use in the whole Union of Equality framework. So, and why this is so? This is so because it's the definition that they use in the European Gender Equality Institute. So gender and sex are put as kind of master categories. So they look at intersectionality as like whatever we can add to gender and sex. This is, in my opinion, a bit problematic, and we will come back to this later. The other problem that I see here is also the focus on personal characteristics or identities. And going back to the quality criteria that I showed you, I can also find this there because they were already 10 years ago, our colleagues were suggesting to focus on the structural understanding of inequalities. We are not there yet because this focus is really on personal characteristics or identities is everywhere in the strategies. I will show you also other examples from other strategies. So I would like to just for you to focus to put your attention on these two elements. And then another example is here again, gender equality strategy, very, very positive, the explicit reference to intersectionality of gender with other grounds of discrimination. So we have again the gender first principle applied. Again, the discrimination based on several personal characteristics. So you can see that this is recurrent language. This is really the formulation of the policy. And then may face discrimination on 3 or more grounds. So this is also very vague, but also very additive kinds of way of approach. So it relates more to multiple discrimination than not to a new idea of intersecting inequalities. And then, yeah, at the end, another kind of vague, although still positive formulation, the intersectional perspective will always inform gender equality policies. It is not so clear how, if you read the entire text, but still it's an explicit kind of commitment. So for sure, more than welcome. Similarly, in EU Anti-Racism Action Plan 2020-2025, we can see that they are referring to different forms of racism, including anti-Gypsyism, anti-Semitism, and so on. This is again very, very positive approach, very interesting way of really broadening the scope of this anti-racism action plan. Again, the explicit reference to an intersectional approach. And then again, a kind of vague formulation. So an intersectional perspective deepens understanding of structural racism and make responses more effective. But it is not so clear how it does so. What does it mean, makes responses more effective, and how it is then translated in practical, as this is especially an action plan, how is this translated into practice? And then I think this is the last example I have, is on the EU Roma Strategic Framework for Equality, Inclusion and Participation. We have again the focus on identity, so on the personal characteristics again. And then we have something else that I would like to reflect upon together with you. It's like mainstreaming Roma equality, inclusion and participation in all relevant Commission initiatives will be key to achieving the objectives set out in this strategic framework. Why I found this fascinating is because in all the strategies, they are trying to mainstream the key issue of the strategy. For instance, mainstreaming gender, mainstreaming Roma, mainstreaming. There is always a mainstreaming of something. But to me, it's still a bit problematic to see how all these mainstreamings will actually happen and how they are conceived to work together in a broader mainstreaming of equality, as they are referring to, like, I think it's also, yeah, mainstreaming equality into all EU policy initiatives. So for me, it's a bit problematic to see how this concept, the very concept of mainstreaming, applies here.
Just keep an eye on the clock.
Yes, and I finished. So the reflections, and here I will close, because this is more for me kind of still a question mark. The reflections are, can we actually, they concern this question, can we actually talk about mainstreaming intersectionality in EU equality policies? So as I said, for sure, what I see as really promising evolution and change and shift is this use articulation, very explicit articulation of intersectionality within the current contemporary Union of Equality, so the EU equality policy agenda. I see this has, in my opinion, huge potential, also in terms of reducing fragmentation and compartmentalization of policies. But unfortunately, I still see the list of perils growing kind of longer if I consider how the current formulation. So the main perils that I see in this misapplication of intersectionality is, for instance, as I was mentioning, the gender first principle still applies. We know that this has been discussed now for a long time, the fact that gender has been always treated as a kind of a master category in EU equality policies, and this has had implication in the way we understand also inequalities. This can be also reflected into academic work on intersectionality. So we have all the criticism, for instance, from Sima Bilge on the whitening of intersectionality by white feminist scholars and mainly gender scholars in Europe. So this is something I think that it's still visible in then the way policies are formulated, and we as intersectionality scholars should reflect on this a bit more. So we are still within a very white kind of logic. Then the depoliticization, again, as several scholars also recently have, especially implementation scholars, have referred to intersectionality as kind of empty signifier. So it's more for institutional taming, for putting the term here and there. But what does it mean then? You know, we are risking to really erase the critical potential of intersectionality. And this would be bad news for the quality of policies on equality. And then finally, the last part that I was already mentioning when presenting you these few examples is this lack of structural understanding of inequalities. So the focus is still very much on individual characteristics and identity markers instead of a more kind of systemic understanding and a focus on the power asymmetries that determine inequalities and current forms of marginalization. So these are my main reflections. These are my main also big question marks and yeah, open questions, whatever we want to call it. But this is the core. These are the core issues that I would like to elaborate further in this paper. And here I conclude and thank you all for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Well, I directly give the floor to Pauline if you want to share a few thoughts.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and it put some flesh on the bones of what you sent me to read. So that was good. So I get a firmer grip, I think, of the kind of analysis you're interested in taking forward here. I mean, I have been thinking about these things for a long time, but not maybe in this particular way. But I'll say the thing that I always say, and that is, as a sociologist, we've been thinking about intersectionality for so long. And the idea that it has become fashionable, not just in political context, but in terms of policy science as well, is fascinating to me. But it's a little bit like how norms became fashionable in international relations in the 1990s when people started to talk about European integration. But it's very important, I think, and I think this is the merit of some of Serena's work, to offer us this very systematic and empirically grounded approach to identifying where it appears and how it might matter in terms of where it appears, particularly at the level of the European Union. So, I mean, these are, I suppose, fundamentally debates about knowledge production, aren't they? And they are about epistemic struggle. And these are things I've looked at in the context of European civil society engagement. And I know that Serena is also very focused on the Romani women's sector and looking at its efforts to try and insert an intersectional analysis in its transnational strategies within its own community, and also trying to affect policy change in that sense. And I've been quite taken, I think, with Serena's approach, and it's not reflected here, maybe we'll have time to discuss it, but trying to think about maybe diffusion of kind of bottom-up and more academic, and then also top-down political forms of knowledge, and looking at maybe what sticks, essentially, what resonates, whose knowledge counts. And I suppose, to quote Kugo and Francesca on this, whose knowledge counts, whose politics matters, and who gets to be part of the European story. And so fundamentally, I think the richness of some of this kind of discussion is about trying to answer some of those particular questions in that way. So if we look particularly at this whole issue of mainstreaming, I think also Petra's work on this, Petra Arend's work, and just the difficulties, the negative, the pejorative association that actually policymakers have when they hear about mainstreaming and their responsibilities often, particularly in the domestic context. But then how kind of more critical gender scholars, their reaction to the kind of exhaustion around the limits of mainstreaming. And then the tensions that naturally arise when we connect the issue of mainstreaming with the objective of intersectionality and the dilemmas within that. But I will go back to something that you wrote yourself, Serena, another piece, and that is how we can understand whether intersectionality becomes part of the policy tissue. And I think that's a very important metaphor here. I think you're at the very beginning of a journey here on this, and you're looking at the documents and the formal statements. But this is about trying to get into the sinews of the policy system itself, I think. And certainly for many of us in the domestic context looking at these issues, we're only at the beginning of that journey in some sense around gender mainstreaming. So to think about intersectionality as this new, I suppose, bus arriving into the station, I think can be very confronting, again, for policymakers, civil servants, but also even for academics trying to make sense of exactly, again, what resonates, what sticks, and in what ways does it matter. So what do we already know? What's been established? And you've reaffirmed some of these points here. We know that there's been an appropriation of intersectionality by gender mainstreaming technocrats. That's clear. Mm-hmm. We know the gender first approach is prescient. And from your overview here of the strategies, we know that we find very vague articulation. The traces of an additive approach are still clear. There is a strong individualizing component here in what you found. Certainly, there is this particular focus on identity and the personal characteristics. And these things are kind of affirming, I think, the previous analysis and things that you would suspect or sadly suggest you might find in these kinds of statements. So fundamentally, I suppose, and going back to Okugo, maybe Ashley Christopher's work on this, and they're looking at civil society, and I know this is work you're super familiar with, but these really are ontological and epistemological assumptions that are sitting behind these particular frameworks. And really this idea of, are the kinds of rhetorical commitments that you're finding, the signaling of a change, of an appetite for change, are they also signaling kind of this ontological change, particularly pushing against these more static views that you know very well in your own work around specific sets of constituents that are understood as oppressed? The other thing I know that you've talked about a lot in your own work, and you signaled it a few moments ago in your remarks, is this notion of who is the beacon, who is the pathfinder here? Who is the kind, where is the expertise? You've been very clear that the EIGE definition of intersectionality is very predominant. And we know, despite maybe some of the kinds of contributions that EIGE tries to make, how problematic some of its assumptions are and how limiting they can be, particularly when they become hegemonic in these particular spaces in that way. So, I mean, fundamentally, there are lots of tensions here and dilemmas, I suppose, that you'll have to confront. I have some kinds of empirical questions that I think you might, I don't know if you're going to be able to get the data to be able to answer some of these things, and it is early days. But really, what are the choices? Are there choices around this issue of an intersectional policy that focuses, as you've suggested, on a certain group? This notion maybe it's almost like a unitary strategy in some sense, and just trying to get a sense of their needs at a particular point of intersection? Or are we back to trying to combine that with some focus on certain issues at European level, be it violence against women or honor killings or whatever? So you're addressing a dimension of an intersectional experience, and then you're adding on, as you've said there, different dimensions of that experience depending on who you are and the communities you belong to. If we focus particularly then on how this might matter and how it could be articulated, I suppose the practitioners are the really important things to think about here. And the people who write the strategies, the people who will be subjected to some kinds of responsibilities around taking them forward. And I'm thinking here about, of course, how they will conceptualize and understand this kind of language. And the patterns of subjectivation, this is really important, that may be operating here, that will accompany these strategies and the interpretation of them. The cognitive maps of policymakers, of civil servants, of EU officials themselves, and then their domestic counterparts. And of course, all the things that we know about their own lack of diversity, their narrow forms of expertise in the legal professions or the European universities. And also the infiltration, if you like, of certain kinds of knowledge that you're so clear about here, be it EIGE, toolkits, this mapping, scoping, measuring. Let's make intersectionality visible, but let's measure it. Let's try to put a particular formula around it that also often then relies upon these static conceptions. Then also, if we think about it, apart from those cognitive maps and how this kind of new thinking might interrupt that or create new thinking or pull people out of this cognitive lock they might have had. We've only just figured out what gender mainstreaming means. Now we're being confronted with this challenge. You know, how will they deal with that? Then also I'm thinking about, in a very fundamental way, the conversation we had many years ago about who will be in charge. If the idea is that these strategies are to talk to each other, there are to be synergies between these strategies. What about the portfolios, the divides, the different units within the Commission, the different people that have ownership or sponsorship of the different strategies? What would great synergy mean between them? How would that look in terms of who talks to whom, who shares information? Are there particular I suppose, soft spots here where there may be more capacity for learning, for just diffusion, more openness than others? Or there's those territorial instincts that we know folks have around their expertise or knowledge, their competency, how confronting that could be. Then what would co-creation or co-design look like? I mean, fundamentally, we understand that the kind of the measure of good intersectionality, if you like, the quality mark of good intersectionality would be deep, meaningful co-creation, co-design of policy. And certainly it's one of your checkpoints in the relative quality of civil society involvement. I mean, for instance, you know, on your other side of the house of the work that you do, have you chatted to and consulted Romani rights groups domestically or internationally on their views of the perils and the promises? I'd love to know, is there a consensus forming on this? You know, do they have a sense of what could this provide in terms of opportunities for them to become more involved? Do they have optimism, or are they less optimistic? What about opportunities for things like the mutual learning programs of the EU on this? You know, I just got finished some strange one of these on gender norms for Ireland, and they're odd things in many ways, but the one thing I was surprised at was how many ground level organisations, maybe it was an aberration what happened in Ireland, but there were some interesting civil society groups pulled into that space to talk about gender norms and to talk about different kinds of public programs. Will we see the fetishization of the law again? Equinet, will it be about legal, you know, scholars getting back in to the space, maybe getting a firmer hold of it? Will there be a danger in that, or is there promise also in the legal perspective on this? What about the big think tanks? You know, I often think about the German foundations. Even Oxfam have done actually quite interesting work on intersectionality and implementation in their policy and programs. Would they have a role? Would they could be a new kind of epistemic source of challenge or complement in this sense? And then the data piece. This reflects debates going on in Ireland because we have very poor data to support any kind of intersectional analysis of policy. How could these support, I know what has been a call for an EU-wide data equality approach, particularly the tension between, if you're focusing here upon individual experiences, that speaks to experiential and qualitative accounts. It doesn't necessarily speak to big data sets, but then the obligation to even collect ethnic identifier data is one that's not generally taken up seriously in a comprehensive way across the EU. The bigger questions also then pertain to how will this matter at the member state level. I mean, I've just finished a process of working with EIGE on the National Recovery and Resilience Programme and how it was or wasn't gender mainstreamed in Ireland. And in interviews with civil society or with civil servants who were in charge of operationalising their responsibilities under the NNRP, they were obsessed with the do no significant harm principle. They thought it was an incredibly interesting intellectual exercise to think about how their policies could do no significant harm around the Green Deal, but they had little or no regard even just for the basic requirements around gender mainstreaming. So their imagination, their policy imagination was taken up with a completely different set of principles rather than an equality-based principle. So the crowding out of this by sustainability or other kinds of objectives, I think, are risks. I'm coming to an end now. Also, the implications then for all of this with what we know is going on. What happens when radical right folks associate this with critical race theory. What happens when this is contested? You know, will they see this as a threat in particular ways? Will they use it rhetorically to try and to push back against this particularly? And then can any of this work if it's not linked to some kind of decolonial impulse, some kind of conversation about decolonial issues, and also around the necropolitics of European policy generally in terms of the Mediterranean and its migration stance? And the last couple of things I just want to say relate to Hans Kvassi's work, which I know is very influential for your own. And I've only read her work a long time ago related to care ethics. And I just wondered, with our kind of the proliferation of debates around care and the care ethic, I mean, one of her basic points of interest originally was connecting intersectionality with care ethics through looking at domestic workers, isn't that right? And migrant workers. And I wonder, is there an opportunity to think about here how to see if care has purchase in a way that it could create a synergy across the strategies, embedding some kind of appreciation or sensibility around care and care ethics in a critical way that then could link up around issues around the Green Deal, the feminist Green Deal, climate catastrophe, other kinds of issues. Finally, I suppose I'm going to lean on what a colleague of mine who's written a new book on the eco-welfare state, which she tried to call the she-co-welfare state. Then we gave her too much stick on it. But from because you referenced directly a feminist, eco-feminist perspective here, and that is this notion of a new institutional imaginary. You know, really thinking outside the box. You know, this literature on open institutions. Can any of these strategies really evolve toward a more intersectional outcome unless we have an entirely new institutional imagination, an institutional imaginary that could match the really exciting forms of political imagination that we find in the Romani community, that we find in indigenous populations, that we, you know, the forms of what we call high energy democracy that are present, as you well know, in autonomous movements, and their rethinking of how politics should work. Because fundamentally this is about, if this is serious as a project, about rethinking how politics, not just policy and democracy, obviously. And this leads me to the last point, which is in the big narratives of justification around the European project, around EU values, where will this sit? Is this an argument for more Europe, less Europe? You know, the kinds of tensions that sit at the heart of, I think, what David has patronative called the not very generous European values, from what I can remember. You know, where does this sit in the broader narrative, or what I would refer to as the political grammar of European integration, of the EU project? How would intersectionality interrupt, align with, contest the struggle? You know, I'm thinking about the very low profile within the debate on Ukraine for Roma people. Where are they in that debate around rescuing Ukrainian people in that sense? So I know these are big ideas and we won't talk about them all today, but I think it's such an exciting area of research. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to think about it and to talk about it with you today.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I have to say, just to give also a few seconds to Serena to just digest all that you've just said and try to think about on our answers. I'm very much seduced by this idea of a new institutional imaginary. It is really, really interesting and so in line with what you are thinking about and what we have to indeed to do to continue doing and implement how to implement this imaginary and in the institutional imaginary. It's yeah, I think it's a fascinating idea. But yeah.
Yeah, it's actually very good that you made this point because it's where I wanted to start. I also think that also for this idea of an institutional imaginary would really like this paper would, yeah, I think that it would fit very well there, because unfortunately it's still, you know, very much about imagining like how equality and equity especially could actually, you know, finally become more intersectional in actual policies. We are still not there. I do not even have an answer how we could get there, and so it's still very much into our kind of wishful thinking more approach. And I was thinking about this institutional imaginary already, especially inspired by some feminist scholarship. I was thinking, for instance, of Johnny Lewandowski's work also on how we should actually dismantle, really have a radical approach to, you know, like in that specific case, gendering current institutions. Like, without dismantling current institutions, is it possible to actually get to a real, you know, like gendered view or intersectional view in my case, and approach to politics, to policies, and so on? So without, can we actually really start a new process building on very old conceptions and structures? So this is something that is really fascinating for me, that feminist scholars are now addressing in terms of design and redesigning institutions, redesigning policies based on completely new conceptions and new understanding. This is, to me, very much part of this broader institutional imaginary kind of idea, because it's still very far from reality. Although we are now also seeing new concrete proposals on how to redesign. Also Karen is very much working on, Karen Celis is very much working on this. She has recently published also a book on this with Sarah Childs. So scholars are really proposing some concrete actions on how to redesign our power structures and institution politics and so on. But for me, it is still very much into part of this institutionally imaginary, and I think that it could really, I'm really eager to reflect on this more. So thank you for really mentioning it and making this connection clearer into my mind, because it is still really very much about that, about how we do imagine equity to happen through intersectionality in this specific case. So thanks a lot. I think this is I was thinking about, again, this redesigning issue also when you were mentioning the co-creation. So the co-creation process, and also the kind of a different involvement of civil society organizations, civil society in general. Concerning the Roma, for instance, in my empirical work, I found it very problematic, because it's very much about kind of a window dressing, lip service kind of situation, where you have very big, highly professionalized organization that are involved in the consultations, just again for the kind of sake of ticking the box of including, of, you know, democratizing the whole issue. But then in practice, this very big organization, at least at the member state level, they are not always reflecting the needs of the communities, because they are too far from the communities, actually. So there are many issues going on there in terms of having a co-creation that can be meaningful, that can really turn into, you know, a practical kind of change, and have an impact on communities that actually are the main target of policies, of these policies. So there is a lot of that we need to reflect upon also there, in terms of this element of co-creation, that it's very important. And then something else that that in any way goes back to the issue of reimagining, redesigning, is the actual institutional setting. Really, how fragmented it is, especially if we already think about the Commission and how, the different units and divisions and how they could engage with a meaningful kind of work that goes beyond the single strand strategies that we have now. And it is very difficult for me to imagine how this could be done in practice. I mean, there is an evolution in these 10 years, like since I start from like interviews that I did also at the Commission almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago. I can see that there is an evolution, that also working in a more integrating way, this already turning into some first changes also, at least in the formulation of the policies. Then for the implementation, we will see, but at least this has, we can see some positive changes there. So I think that an evolution is like a positive evolution is still possible, but I cannot yet figure out how this could, really turn into a deep intersectional way of, working and conceiving policies. So thanks a lot for all. It's a lot of food for thought, but I very much enjoyed the reflection on the institutional measures and how I could. I will think more on how I could make this paper fit with this broader idea. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Serena. Yeah, maybe we can open the discussion. I don't know if someone wants to jump in either online or here. I have a lot of questions, but I will go afterwards if someone else has a question first. I don't know, I'm looking. Yeah, Lauren, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really interesting, and it raises a lot of questions for me too. So I was quite happy to attend this presentation. I have one maybe comment or more remark than a question, but maybe you can let me know what you think. So I've been working a bit at EUGE and at the Council of Europe on the gender division, and intersectionality is really present there. I mean, whenever they work on a report, they want to include it. They try to find a way to have different type of data so that they can have kind of an intersectionality approach. And my remark is more like this, like they might be, or even myself as a researcher here in Belgium now, when we want to work on intersectionality, then we face an issue with the data. So of course it's easy to find data for gender, let's say gender, age, education. That's the most important one that we have in mind whenever we do a study. But for instance, for people with disability or race or even social classes, which are also pretty important, sometimes these are either forgotten or not possible to study because we don't have the data. So maybe that's my reflection on intersectionality. I found it really interesting also the way you explain differences between additional discrimination or really the way it's interlinked really. But concretely in my work, then I don't really know how to implement this with the data I have. Yeah, that would be my suggestion, my remark. But thanks a lot again.
Thank you for this question. I'm afraid that we do not really have an answer yet on this, but this is also something I've been thinking a lot about like how we can really use data intersectionally. I think that also the problem is that, there are lots of contradictions also in the way, again, policies are formulated. So the current formulation of policies actually, expects also use of data that is very additive. Like it's all part of the same kind of conception. So based on this current formulation, we cannot really envisage a different way of dealing with data than the one we have now. So we have gender, and then we add I think the issue of data is actually very, very relevant. I do not really have an answer on how we could deal with data in intersectional way based on what we have now in terms of policies. I can see that, for instance, in terms of legislation, especially case law, we could advance a bit the way we use also data, and to start from more individual experiences of discrimination. We have several examples of case law where actually, for instance, just now to mention a brief example on the Roma, this was a debate also because in several countries, you cannot really use data disaggregated by ethnic origin, for instance. So for the Roma, there was this debate, okay, we cannot, really use ethnic data. And so how can we assess the situation of Roma women? There was huge debate about this concerning the Roma. And some countries were kind of trying to solve a bit this, although this is contested, but just to provide you with some concrete examples, by creating some open-ended list of grounds into their legislation. For instance, they were listing the usual grounds in their anti-discrimination legislation, and then they were keeping an open ground at the end that could allow, the legislator to then use their intersectional discrimination. So, like to this kind of open ground where intersectional discrimination could fit, and some countries were identifying this as, a possible solution. I'm not sure that is because then when you look at the current implementation of this, it's not so straightforward. You see that it's not very much used, and you see that actually there is not so much case law where this principle was actually applied. But at least, the reflection behind was, was meaningful in terms of, okay, let's try to identify a solution to, like to deal with concrete cases of intersectional discrimination that actually cannot be solved by, assessing if there was a 50% or 80% discrimination based on gender and 80% on ethnicity, So this is for sure a logic that does not work. It has shown now that it's not really working. But yours is a very difficult question. In my opinion, really, because it really concerns how, like, the big struggle on how intersectionality can actually be put like then into practice, given the current policy tools we also have. So it's, I don't know if anyone has.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Can I indulge myself in
of course
jumping in? And I will directly connect with what you said about case law and about legislation, because with the Pay Transparency Directive, this is the first time we have the notion of intersectionality as such included in an EU piece of legislation, and it is included in the text of the directive. So both at the beginning, like with the general definition, okay, but it's not just there for context. It is also within, at different points within the directive, in a number of articles, especially, for example, in relation to sanctions. So I think that this, and I'm not a lawyer, you're not a lawyer, but I'm sure that here there will be a nod, something very important to see how we will witness or not the transformation from a general principle into a policy instrument. I think it is really important. And on this specific point, we have seen again the coordination and the mutual support between the Commission and the European Parliament in order to achieve this inclusion of the principle of intersectionality within a piece of legislation, and I think it is interesting. What I wanted, so I have a few things I wanted to say, but the first one is, in a way, I think it is fascinating what you do, and I was saying to myself, maybe you're taking them, and them being EU policymakers, a bit too much seriously in a way. They didn't expect that, okay, we are looking into that so thoroughly, because I think that at the moment they are just now trying to manage how to implement equality mainstreaming. And you're pushing them one step forward into intersectionality mainstreaming. And equality mainstreaming is, in fact, 6 people within the Secretary General of the Commission. It is 6 people more than there used to be. So this is indeed, and when you speak about a shift in the last decade, I think that you can be even more specific. And really on intersectionality, the shift they can be really linked to the von der Leyen Commission. It has really been supported by the current Commission, and there's really been a shift there, and of course in relationship with the Parliament, but the shift from the policy or at the policy level happened there, and there have been some changes in the institutional structuring in the bureaucracy to try to implement that. But yeah, in a way, I think you're already one step forward, because there is this idea that the Union of Equality is built on 2 pillars: equality mainstreaming on the one hand side, intersectionality on the other side. And yes, you are trying to merge the two, and how it is possible. How it is possible to do that, and I think that's still very much trying to understand how to and to also get the first results of what has been put in place in order to do some equality mainstreaming and go beyond the mere gender mainstreaming, indeed, to really try to do some equality mainstreaming. I very much agree with Pauline that intersectionality is something that has been more or less kidnapped by some policymakers, thinking that it is fashionable, it is something that we have to put in the picture. But I'm also, and I think maybe I have a too positive bias here, because I'm doing these interviews with the people in charge of the Union of Equality. So I see them struggling, and I think it's making me soft in a way to see how they are struggling to really implement that. And in a way, they are quite proud of what they achieved, being able to put intersectionality within the picture and have it recognized as something that is legitimate, but we are indeed way ahead of real implementation in a way, and I think they would agree with you largely, but the battle has been on principle mainly, I would say, and make this legitimate so that you can have some first stepping stone to build to build afterwards. But well, this is not really constructive. I have maybe just very quickly 2 points I wanted to make. I was wondering if you could find some useful elements for you, some analytical elements in the work which is of Amy Mazur and Isabella Engeli on the gender equality policy in practice, the JEP large-scale program that they have, which tries really to analyze the implementation of the gender. It is about the gender equality policy, but they have a larger scale framework, and the idea is also really to try to do that thanks to classical or normal, I would say, in a way, and policy analysis tools. And it allows also to have comparative views. And I think there are some elements that can be useful for you there, and also to connect to other parts of the literature. And the last thing I wanted to tell you is that I was almost surprised that you didn't entitle the paper "The Promises and Pitfalls of the New Approach," because you know what I'm referring to. There is this article by Alison Woodward from the beginning of the 2000s, which is about gender mainstreaming, and it's called Promises and Pitfalls of Gender Mainstreaming. And what strikes me as someone who has worked on gender mainstreaming for a lot of time is that in a way there are exactly the same questionings and doubts and also fears and skepticism with regard to intersectionality that there was 20 years ago with gender mainstreaming. And it induces a lot of questions for me, both as an analyst of that, but also as an activist in a way. So are we still going back to the same situation, and the pitfalls are still the same? For example, so in these interviews I've done, there are reflections within the Commission. Should we rather have only one strategy in order to be really intersectional? It does not make sense, or to have 5 strategies separated. This is really like an additive approach, like you said. This is a multiple discrimination approach to have 5 different strategies. But so we the pure understanding, or the pure theoretical way to go would be to have only one intersectional strategy. But then practically will it not end in reducing the number of resources? You don't need to have the same number of resources or volume of resources that you have for 5 different strategies if you're only doing one.
Meaning budget.
Meaning budget, meaning human resources, meaning all those things. This is exactly the same of question that arise with gender mainstreaming at the beginning, the risk of dissolution of gender equality policies if you mainstream. And so it's, of course, it's a little bit different, but it is the same kind of questions, of doubts that are being asked with intersectionality.
Indeed.
I mean, just to interject there, I wonder, would also different domestic constituency groups be unhappy if there was one strategy? Because it did occur to me, it's one of the first things that does occur to you when you try to think about this from a policymaker or a kind of European Commission perspective. I mean, those strategies do have a kind of power, even rhetorical power, in domestic debates, and, you know, losing their specificity, you know, could also be problematic in that sense. Yeah, just a thought.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want to add something, Serena. It was just really, so I think what you've seen is that we all had a lot of thoughts going on with what you presented, and we do not really expect that you have answers to what is also from our side, like ongoing reflection. Yeah.
Thanks. I don't have much to add, but I have lots to think about because this is really, you know, that was the purpose of, you know, also of this seminar for me, to have, you know, like, to make these reflections stronger, and really, you know, to also base them on on a broader discussion. This is, as Pauline said at the beginning, it's really a lot about, you know, epistemological and ontological issues, and you know, it's so yeah, I don't know if I have. I was now thinking about Alison words. Actually, I didn't connect to that, like, mentally. Yeah, it was really just by coincidence that I was not, you know, like I had it, of course, in my, you know, in my mind. I've been working with her for a long time, but I was also, with the title, I was not immediately linking to her work from like almost 20 years ago now. So it's I will have a conversation with her, actually. It would be fascinating also, to have.
She would have much to say.
Yeah. But she knows my work very well.
Yeah. It would be really interesting.
Yeah, but it's a pity that she cannot be here today, but she's traveling, so she told me already. But I will have this conversation with her, because I think it could be. It's really, you know, it really opens up a lot of questions about, you know, is this kind of cyclical, you know, like, are we going along the same cycle of, you know, experiences that we had already with gender mainstreaming, and now it's kind of like reproducing it again with a different name that shouldn't be you know, but
I mean, you think about how generational these things are as well, in terms of generations of civil servants, you know, how much knowledge production is sedimented within the policy space, how much gets, you know, diffused across generations of people who work. What gets left behind, what gets, obviously, from what you're saying, Sophie, is there's an appetite and interest, a real kind of eagerness to do this kind of work and to understand it better. But then there are all the kind of blocks, I suppose. Some of them will be cognitive, but more of them are obviously institutional, and in terms of having the know-how or the data. So it's all the different kinds of, and they may be similar to the ones that Alison found. You know, maybe those are the things that have remained, even if the thinking and the intelligence And there's hesitancy of not getting it wrong. I think there is a piece in the European Journal of Gender and Politics that it's in that policy implementation special issue that has Amy's and Isabel's work in it. And I think it looks at the domestic context. I think it looks at policies in France, I believe, around sexual harassment, and this notion of hesitancy of getting things wrong around gender for policymakers, of making a mistake, you know, in terms of debates, whether it's on trans rights or on race, and how that operates as a kind of a drag on policy imagination.
Yeah.
You know, and that is, you know, I suppose the interesting thing here. What would the policy imagination be required in order to loosen some of this, to translate appetite, interest, intellectual engagement into actual a push, you know, for a change?
And then there is also, you know, a whole issue of really politics of, you know, at the national level. For instance, all the civil society organizations, for instance, that are really working on a specific, you know, we go back a bit again to the Oppression Olympics, you know, like there's also, you know, fear of then losing something that it's vital to them.
Yeah,
and,
exactly,
you know,
what we had seen with gender mainstreaming and anti-discrimination, and,
exactly.
and the fact that, for example, you had the EWL, which was really reluctant to anti-discrimination, like 28, almost 30 years ago. Just for the small history, Pauline, you said something that we have to take into account is the institutional memory. And the interview that I did with the task force on equality within the SecGen, which is in charge of applying equality mainstreaming, I did the interview with Agnès Hubert, and so she was really the person who was implementing gender mainstreaming within the Commission in the 90s. And they explained to us how they are concretely doing equality mainstreaming, the machinery that they have put in place, the tools that they use, and a lot of them was exactly what Agnès had done in the 90s, but which had disappeared since then, and was also the time passing by much less supported, because the important element here is the political will and the political context, and the fact that there is some political will at the time being. But it was fascinating to see that it was exactly the recipes that were already imagined almost, not almost, 30 years ago by Agnès, who was in the room. Sorry. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pauline.
Lorraine, Pauline,
see you in
everyone. And have a good afternoon, and thank you again.
I wish you a nice lunch in Brussels.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.